Not listening, man. He said salute.
Page 124.
Did you see my mom before I get I used to pull my mom out of the way.
Huh?
She was pulling me to a parking spot, my mom.
I don't know, man.
Do the chickens have large talons?
Yeah.
What? Large talons.
I don't understand the word you just said.
That you came around the corner like so sharp, like narrow. I was like, okay, I guess I'll just go on the grass.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I was on the grass right there.
Oh, the grass is always...
That thing was dragging me
Leah, did you see my mom this morning? I had to pull her out of the way. She was just like,
Okay.
Please let me this fucking fun.
I thought that she was in the middle of the road.
no, she was like in the
Oops.
One of the right. And you pull in some of my one door, and then you stand over the door opens. It's like,
Close it.
did one close it or I'll close it in front of my mom.
It's yours.
313.5.
That's why we all have.
Yeah.
That's why we should all have cars that have the doors that open up.
All right, I've got a brain model here. And just kind of in review, we have some different parts of the brain. This part right here is the, anybody remember? Cerebrum. Now, the cerebrum has the outside part. The outside part is called the cerebral cortex. Cortex means outside, if you've ever heard that word before. And it's the outside part where the cell bodies of the brain are. The neuron cell bodies are kind of on the outside. And the reason why it has all these convolutions is because it gives it more outside, you see, more surface area on the outside to have more cells. So there's a whole lot of cells packed in here, 100 billion. And they send messages along. Now, if you were to cut this open and look inside of it, you would see a bunch of white material, which are the axons, basically the wiring coming off of the cell bodies, sending the signals into and out of the brain. So it's a very complicated contraption, but the cerebral cortex, whenever we say that, we refer to the cells on the outside of the cerebrum here. And then you have this part right here is called the brain stem. It controls all the subconscious activities. It's often called the reptilian brain because a reptile just has this part of the brain. It has hardly any cerebrum, which means most of a reptile's functions, it doesn't have to think about. It can just do it. It's got all the emotions, fear, and sexual drive, and everything it needs to survive in the wild, and it can control its heart rate, and its breathing, and its blood pressure, and its body temperature. All of that's done here in the brain stem. And we still have that part of the brain, but we evolved this thing around it to give us the ability to think so well. And then this part, what's that part called? Do y'all remember?
The medulla.
The cerebellum is this part. Medulla is right here. This is the cerebellum, and that is for what? Remember?
Balance.
Yes, for coordination. Mm-hmm. And balance is part of coordination, but muscle coordination is right there.
So is that like what alcohol affects?
Well, it's funny. Alcohol has kind of has its effects starting on the outside, moving inward. So if you're drinking a lot of alcohol, which y'all do, I'm just kidding. I know y'all do. It's a joke. It starts to affect the brain from the outside in. So a lot of the rational thinking and stuff like that, your inhibitions and that sort of thing, are in the cerebrum. And so that goes first. And so you start to feel kind of, thank you. kind of tough and strong and invincible and such. Your reasoning brain is on the cerebral cortex. And so you start to lose your reasoning, and you start, you come up to a guy like me and you start to pick a fight or something. Clearly you aren't thinking straight. That would be it for you. And then it sinks down, further down, and it starts to affect your balance and stuff. So if you're really drinking a lot, you have trouble here walking, doing coordinated things like touching your nose and whatever the cops make you do. Finally, as the alcohol reaches the inside and cuts off oxygen to the brainstem, that's when you start to lose all function. People die from their brainstem going dead, and then their heart doesn't beat and they don't breathe, and you can die from that if you get enough alcohol. So it kind of, at that point, you've stopped all conscious activity. You're unconscious. So.
How excessively does someone have to drink to get to that point?
Just so I know.
I think that it's 0.4% alcohol in your blood, something like that.
Based on body weight or something like that.
How is it that loud?
If you take the blood and you divide it up into pieces, it's 0.4%, less than 1%, 0.4%. 0.4% alcohol is enough to do it. You can't have much alcohol in your system. Alcohol is a poison. And so, yeah. There's this part right here in the very center of the brainstem. It's called the reticular activating system. This is what alerts this part right here will alert your conscious brain to awareness. This reticular activating system. People who are in comas, hey, welcome. You got any kind of note or anything? Did you,
Shout out, Sean.
I got some stuff for you.
Oh, you can.
There you go. We're on page 123. I noticed you didn't enter with anything. Probably like pencil, paper, and
A lead stove.
yeah. But it's a class and everything.
But he's late, but he got.
Okay, so I was talking about the reticular activating system right here, also called the RAS. That alerts your body to consciousness. And so it's a part of the brain that's always working, even when you're asleep. Michael, are you with me?
Yes.
And, people in comas have a damaged reticular activating system. So if this part is damaged, you'll never wake up. And sometimes it'll heal itself if it's damaged, and then you will wake back up. But often it will not. And this is the part, if you've ever been asleep and maybe your friends are messing with you and they sneak in the room and then you just kind of wake up and they're right there and how did you know that they were there? Well, your reticular activating system is constantly keeping track of sounds and smells and temperature and that sort of thing. And if it sees something change or something awkward, and it'll decide on its own, I should wake this person from make this person conscious because something weird's going on. And so your reticular activating system is constantly monitoring your environment, even when you're asleep. And if it thinks it's important enough that whatever's going on, smoke or whatever, a loud sound or even a slight sound, somebody sneaking into your room, it can send signals that will to the cerebrum and get you awake, and so you're conscious, you can be consciously aware.
Is that how you go into a coma? Is that thing doesn't work?
If that thing's broken, that's right. Mm-hmm. And so the reticular activating system is part of your brainstem. Like I said, the medulla oblongata, that's here, responsible for breathing and heart rate and some other automatic things. It's also part of your emotional system. Runs through here. Your emotions are shared by the brainstem, and they're kind of, we haven't exactly figured out how emotions work, but it's kind of spread out throughout the brainstem. We call it your limbic system. Have you ever heard that before? Your limbic system is in control of your emotions, and your medulla is part of that. Y'all remember in Waterboy when he said there's something wrong with his medulla oblongata? Y'all see that? Is that too old?
Classic.
Yeah, that's a great line. I need to put that in here. Anyway, he's talking about the alligator's ornery because of his medulla oblongata, because that's where their emotions are too, in an alligator's brain. The pons right here involved in sleep, waking, dreaming. It's also like I said, it's kind of like a central hub of neuron activity that chooses the correct place to send signals into the cerebrum. It also communicates back and forth with the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, to send a signal out, it has to send things through the pons first. The pons is pretty active site. You can sit here, you can study the brain for years, and not fully understand it. People study it all their lives. We don't really know exactly how it works yet, but I think they'll one day figure it out. They've been researching it for a couple hundred years, and it might take a couple hundred more years because it's just so complicated. But we're learning more and more. Let's take a little closer at the well, there's a couple areas here higher up above the brainstem. This area here is called the midbrain. So the brainstem's down here, and then above that, this area is called the midbrain. So you have your hypothalamus. That controls your pituitary gland. Your pituitary gland squirts out about 8 or 10 hormones that help control your body. There's growth hormone. There's thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone. They're hormones that control other glands in your body. There's sex hormones here. Pituitary sends out hormones that get your sexual organs to work correctly. And so the pituitary is very active. It's called the master gland. And there's a whole area of the brain called the hypothalamus that's responsible for working the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is also where body temperature is regulated and blood pressure. And so hypothalamus is pretty important. Hunger and thirst also. And then the thalamus up here is another relay station, kind of like the pons. Some of the signals will go from the pons to the thalamus, and the thalamus will further relay the signals to the correct area of the cerebrum. So that's that area there. It's another relay station. The limbic system I spoke of earlier, it's involved in emotions, and it includes the brain stem here, but it also includes all the highlighted areas here. And your memory is formed here too. There's a couple of interesting parts, psychology related. This part here, the amygdala. The amygdala checks everything that's coming in and checks it for danger. And so, for instance, you've probably, if you've been walking along, and your friend jumps out and scares you. And, you're, and then you see it's just your friend, and you're like, oh, it's okay. The amygdala checks incoming information really quickly. And when your friend jumps out, it goes, okay, there's somebody jumping out at me, we have danger, and it quickly alerts your entire body for the fight and flight, the sympathetic nervous system for fight or flight. It takes a while for your conscious brain to figure out that it's just your friend and not a real attacker. And then your conscious brain will send signals to tell the sympathetic nervous system to stop that. You don't need to react like that. And so your amygdala is what first checks out this incoming sensory information and makes a quick decision for you. So your amygdala is what makes you scared at first. A lot of very emotional things you can are kind of burned into memory. Like y'all probably, let's see, when were y'all born? What year?
95.
95. So do y'all remember 9/11? Yeah. Do you remember where you were the first day when you heard about the attacks? There's a reason that's burned into your memory so well. And it's because if the amygdala experiences great emotion, the amygdala is wired so it sends that information, what's going on at that time, to this area right here. This is called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is where memory is formed, is the start of memory formation. And the hippocampus will make sure to remember anything that's highly emotional. Because if it's highly emotional, it's probably important. Caveman stumbles into a cave and a bear jumps out at him. Hey, don't you think it's important to remember not to come to that cave again because there's a bear in it? Probably so. So that emotional thing is burned into the memory of the caveman. He'll never forget where that bear was. Go ahead.
How does the hippocampus decide whether to keep the memory or repress it?
That's a good question. We don't know. Nobody knows exactly how it works. But they do know this. If the hippocampus is injured, you can't form new memories. And your reading talks about a guy who had a stroke or something, and the hippocampus lost blood and died, and he can't remember anything new. And he has old memories that are stored in his brain, and he can recall anything before the injury very well, with great detail. But you come up to the guy and you say, hey, my name's Tom Willis. And, okay, turn your head that way. Turn back to me. You'd be like, hey, who are you? He can't form any new memories. It's kind of like that movie, 50 First Dates. No, that wasn't it. Was that it, 50 First Dates? The hippocampus is the structure for forming new memories.
There was this kid who, if he would talk, I knew him back in Atlanta. You talk to him, he would just look away because he for some reason he couldn't stay focused on you. Like he couldn't listen to more than one or two words you were saying, just because there's something in his brain that prevented him from listening.
I don't know if that would be the same as the hippocampus or not, but again, there's so much in the brain that attention is, I don't know. It might be a single area of the brain, or it might be some kind of general, anxiety disorder or something like that. I don't know. So amygdala and hippocampus, too big. Amygdala involved in quick decisions in emotion, hippocampus, new memories. Now, the brain is divided up into four. The cerebrum is divided up into four lobes. This is the cerebrum here. You have your frontal lobe, your parietal lobe, your occipital lobe, and your temporal lobe. And basically it's wired like this. The frontal lobe has a lot of decision making in there. Decision making, controlling your emotions as best as it can. Your personality seems to be seated in the frontal lobe. What your personality is like. Injuries to the frontal lobe will change your personality.
Is that what
That's the thing they do when they stick the red hot poker up there. They stick it in the frontal lobe to try and change somebody's personality. So the thinking, planning, movement is controlled in the frontal lobe too. It's toward the back of the frontal lobe. There's an area of the cerebrum here called the motor cortex. It's right about here in the brain. And I guess I should get this model here. So right about there, there's an area called the motor cortex. And it controls all your muscles. So if I'm moving my arm here, see, I'm moving it. That's coming from somewhere in this part of my brain. And they have it mapped out pretty well which part of the brain controls which muscles. Because you can go in there with an electrode and hit that part and this muscle moves. Hit that part and this muscle moves. Have you ever seen the commercial where the doctor's playing with it and making the patient do all these things? What is it? Kayak, yeah. So they know pretty well about what controls muscle movement. So all muscle movement originates from that part of the brain. You could imagine if there was a stroke and you lost oxygen, you lost blood flow to this part of the brain, you wouldn't be able to move. Yeah.
I thought it was different for each person. Like what?
It does differ a little bit, the exact location, but it still has basically the same framework. You know, usually I think muscles of the head and tongue and talking muscles and stuff are higher up, and muscles that move the hand and feet and that stuff are lower down. And that's usually how it is. But it's not exactly the same in each person, you're right. So that's called the motor cortex. That's all movement. Now the parietal lobe here has the somatosensory cortex. That's this part right here. That's where all your feeling comes from. Somebody touches your hand, it's not felt. You don't feel someone touch your hand until the signal reaches this part of the brain. So if you stimulate this part of the brain with an electrode, the person will feel something. You know, they stimulate it here and the person goes, somebody's touching my hand. And they stimulate it here and they someone's yanking on my tongue. And so on and so forth. You can, that feels, I'm getting a pain sensation from my lower leg, you know. So everything you feel is right in there. The rest of the parietal lobe is involved, well, actually the entire brain is involved in memory, we know, and the parietal lobe included. Memories are not stored, we don't think, in a particular location. Like if you damage that part of your brain, you would forget about your last year's prom. It doesn't work like that. Last year's prom is somehow stored all over the brain. And scientists don't know how that works. But you can't eliminate just a certain location of the brain and lose a certain memory. It was once thought that that's probably was the case, and we now know that that's not true.
Can you get rid of
But if you do lose enough of the brain, you'll start to lose memories. And so it's like it's spread out somehow.
Can you get rid of all of them, like in the Wolverine movie?
They remove all his memories?
Well, they shoot him in the head and then his brain repairs itself.
Oh, and he loses all his memories? Yeah. I don't know if that would really work.
That's really
But other than that, most of the stuff in comic books movies is true. The occipital lobe back here is highly devoted to vision. And it's strange that your eyes are in front and everything associated with vision is in back. But that's true. If you get hit in the back of the head, you'll see stars. You ever heard that? And if the back of the head is damaged, you'll start seeing things. So that part of the brain is involved in vision. And then the temporal lobe here is involved in hearing. There are parts of the temporal lobe that can be damaged, and you won't be able to hear. There's particular parts of the temporal lobe involved in speech that can be damaged, and you can't understand speech. And so it gets pretty involved. You can see right there, there's the auditory cortex. That's majorly involved in hearing. Leah, you got...
When you have meningitis, like...
My brother had meningitis and he was like 9 and forgot how to read and write like completely.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, now what meningitis is, it's an infection where bacteria get in your meninges. And the entire brain is surrounded by a covering called the meninges. And it's got a little fluid that runs, the whole brain is kind of surrounded in fluid. And these bacteria can get in the fluid and multiply and start eating up parts of the brain. So he had an infection and you said he lost his hearing?
No, he lost his ability to read and write.
To read? Yeah, well, I don't know where that would be. That's a good question. It might have been part of the motor cortex since he couldn't write. It could have been part of the occipital lobe if he couldn't see very well to read.
He relearned.
Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know. Again, they don't exactly know how this works, how the brain exactly works, but interesting stuff. For our class, we don't... In this basic psychology class, you just need to know the basics of where things are. If you really want to go into this, if you're going to be a psychologist or a brain surgeon, you take entire classes devoted to the brain. You know, a brain surgeon would do it for years. What part of the brain is what everything does, how it works. There's I read these magazines, Popular Science, Discover. Almost every issue they have a new article saying, look what we found out about how the brain works. So it's an evolving subject. They're getting better and better at figuring this kind of stuff out. This is the skull of a guy named Phineas Gage. It's a case study. He was a railroad worker, and he was walking along, and there was an explosion, and it shot a piece of rebar through his head. And you can see the path it took. It came in through his cheek, went right under his cheekbone, and went right through his frontal lobe and destroyed all that part of the brain. It came out the top of his skull. Bam. It didn't kill him, which is incredible. And he finally healed up, and they said that before the explosion, he was this very mild-mannered, quiet, church-going gentleman who was the nicest guy in the world, and after the accident, he was this crotchety, cursing, no one could stand to be around him. It completely changed his personality.
I mean, it's probably because he had a pole going through his head. That'd be pretty, crusty too.
Yeah, maybe. He worked at a sideshow exhibit, as a sideshow exhibit for much of his life. Recently, they found a picture. I wonder if I put it in here. No, I didn't. Recently, they found a picture of Phineas Gage holding this piece of rebar that went through his head, and it was a lost photo that somebody had in their attic or something. They just found it like in the last couple of years. It was in one of those magazines. It was pretty cool.
Is he like blind in one eye?
Yes. This part of his face is mangled and his eye didn't work, but totally changed his personality. And a guy who had never said a curse word in his life just was constantly cursing, and it was an interesting study of what can happen if you damage your frontal lobe. So, read the rest of section page 121 all the way to 128. And there could be a quiz on that tomorrow.
There's going to be a quiz.
after